Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you felt this intense, almost suffocating pressure to be an absolute expert?
Oh, constantly.
Right. Like, think about it. Maybe you're at a dinner party and a highly controversial topic comes up. Or perhaps you're stepping into a boardroom or just trying to share a deeply held personal belief with a friend. We live in a world that constantly tells you that to be taken seriously, you need to have a flawless, polished argument ready to go.
You really do.
You need a mental bibliography, a spreadsheet of data, and the perfect, unshakable delivery. It can feel incredibly overwhelming,
It
right?
really can. And that pressure, it often leads to a kind of paralysis. When we feel we have to perform at an expert level just to justify our perspective or even our own lived experiences, most of us simply choose to stay quiet. We retreat.
Which brings us to the core of what we're looking at today. Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating document. It's titled 008 The Power of Personal Testimony.pdf. Now, to be clear right up front, this is a deeply theological text.
Yes, very much so.
It's written specifically about Christian evangelism and how believers share their faith. But our mission today isn't to debate theology or take any sides.
Exactly.
Whether you share the religious convictions of this text or not, we're going to unpack the profound psychological and sociological paradigm shift it presents. Because the underlying logic here is universally fascinating.
It really is.
The core premise is that your ordinary, unpolished, and imperfect lived experience is actually the most powerful, irrefutable communication tool you possess. We're going to strip away this modern pressure of performance and rediscover the quiet power of authenticity.
It's a radically simple solution to a very modern problem. We are living in an era of intense information overload. Think about your daily life. You are surrounded by carefully branded messaging, debates on demand, targeted ads, and polished public relations.
We've developed incredibly thick armor against being sold to.
We have. But in the midst of all that noise, this material argues that people are actually starving for truth that wears a human face.
I find this strategy so compelling from a purely human communication level. It suggests you don't need a microphone, a pulpit, or a perfectly crafted philosophical argument to connect with someone or change a mind. You just need a story. Your story.
Yeah.
But there's a quiet tension named early in these pages, a core problem that really drives the whole document. It points out that many people, specifically within the church context it's discussing, have bought into the myth of the expert.
Right.
They view sharing their core beliefs as a performance. They think it requires a mastery of complex doctrine or a naturally charismatic, extroverted personality.
And when any kind of deep personal conviction is warped into a performance, it causes people to compartmentalize. Faith, or any deeply held worldview, becomes this private, guarded thing because the barrier to entry for talking about it feels way too high.
There's a quote from the source that perfectly captures the tragedy of this. It says, "Faith that never leaves the mind struggles to take root in the world."
What's fascinating here is how that idea connects to our specific cultural moment. We live in what sociologists often call a postmodern age. That's a heavy term, but essentially it means we live in a society that is deeply skeptical of massive institutions, grand sweeping narratives, and absolute moral posturing.
People are just naturally suspicious now.
Exactly. If you approach someone today with a slick, abstract argument, no matter how logically sound it might be, their defenses go up instantly. They recognize it as a system. And human nature in the 21st century is to instinctively look for the flaws in that system.
But wait, isn't there a danger there? I mean, playing devil's advocate for a second. If we completely abandon objective arguments and data, don't we just end up in a world where everyone has their own truth and nothing is grounded in reality? Data and logic have to matter, right?
It's a fair question. And the document doesn't dismiss the concept of objective truth at all. Rather, it's making a point about how human beings actually process and accept truth. You can debate a philosophy all day long. You can throw data points back and forth until you're blue in the face. But you cannot argue with a transformed life.
Wow, yeah.
A personal story bypasses those critical, cynical defense mechanisms. It shifts the conversation from a clash of ideologies to an encounter with reality.
Because it's disarming. When someone sits across from you and simply says, "Look, I don't have all the answers, but here's what happened to me," you naturally lean in. You aren't being asked to sign a contract. You're being invited to listen to a human experience.
Precisely. The framework here describes it as existential evidence. In a court of law or a formal debate, arguments invite evaluation. You sit back and judge them. But a testimony invites recognition. The listener might not agree with your worldview, they might not understand your theology, but they cannot easily deny your lived reality.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because how does this actually work in practice? It sounds great in theory, but the document takes us deep into what it calls the theology of story. And it makes a really bold claim. It emphasizes that actions actually come before explanations.
Yes, there's a consistent biblical pattern highlighted here. God always acts before he explains. The Exodus is used as a prime example. When the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, God didn't hand them a theological textbook.
Right.
You didn't drop a comprehensive list of moral laws and say, study this, pass a test, and then I'll save you. The narrative is that he rescued them first. He parted the sea, provided food in the desert, delivered them from slavery. The theology, the laws, the complex understanding of what it all meant, that all came later as a reflection on that initial lived encounter.
But again, my skeptical brain kicks in. If we just rely on the raw experience without the theological textbook up front, don't we risk completely misinterpreting what happened? Human memory is notoriously unreliable.
That is exactly why the text pairs the experience with a specific cultural practice. It introduces a really interesting Hebrew word, zakar.
Zakar.
Yes,
Yeah.
it means to remember, but also to proclaim. In this tradition, memory isn't just passive nostalgia, like looking at an old photo album. It is an active spiritual discipline. You are called to continually retell the story of what happened, because the act of retelling it anchors your identity and keeps the interpretation grounded in community.
So the experience happens first, but the zakar, the act of remembering, is what gives it lasting meaning.
Exactly.
That actually mirrors how we learn the most important things in our own lives. Think about it. You don't learn how to navigate a complex marriage or how to process deep grief by reading a manual. You learn by experiencing it or by seeing someone else model it in real time. The text uses a phrase for this: incarnational witness.
And for anyone who might not use a term like incarnational every day, it essentially means taking an abstract, high-level idea and wrapping it in human flesh. It's making the invisible visible through real-world experience. The argument here is that the divine chose flesh and story over abstraction.
Right, because Jesus is presented in the text as the ultimate testimony. He didn't just stand on a cloud and deliver propositional truths, which is just a fancy way of saying a list of factual statements from a safe distance. The narrative relies on the idea that divine truth was lived out in gritty human experiences: hunger, pain, betrayal, and friendship.
Which brings us to a major paradigm shift in how this document views who's actually qualified to share these stories.
This might be the most disruptive part of the whole text. It completely dismantles what we'd call the clergy-laity divide. The idea that religious communication or evangelism belongs exclusively to a trained professional class of priests or pastors. The document argues that this is historically completely inaccurate. The early Christian movement didn't spread through professional mass communication. There were no slick PR campaigns or stadium events. It spread through proximity.
Through households, marketplaces, and dinner tables. The perspective here is very clear. The gospel advanced not primarily through specialists like trained academic apologists who study philosophical defense, but through ordinary people who simply told the truth about what happened to them.
To back this up, the source provides some incredible case studies. Let's look at the Samaritan woman at the well from the Gospel of John. Sociologically speaking, this is fascinating. She was socially and morally marginalized in her community.
She was.
She had absolutely zero theological credentials. She wasn't a leader. And yet, she doesn't try to debate anyone. Her entire method was just an invitation. She goes back to the village that ostracized her and says, "Come, see a man who told me everything I ever did."
Her unpolished honesty was the catalyst that transformed an entire village. It's a perfect example of the marginalized being the most effective messengers because they have nothing to lose and no pretense to maintain. And we can contrast her story with the example of Paul standing before King Agrippa found in the book of Acts.
Now, that's such a completely different setting. Paul is a highly educated guy, and he's standing in a hostile intellectual courtroom. His life is on the line.
Exactly. He's facing entrenched political power and intense legal scrutiny. But notice how Paul handles this. Even with his vast education, he doesn't try to out-argue them with Greek philosophy or complex legal precedents. The document highlights that he relies on a remarkably simple three-part narrative: his life before encountering Christ, the encounter itself on the road to Damascus, and his life after.
But wait, did he really just tell a personal story to a king who held his life in his hands? That seems incredibly risky. Wouldn't the king just dismiss it as anecdotal?
That's the brilliance of the strategy. He respected his audience's intelligence, but he anchored his defense in something they couldn't cross-examine: his own lived experience. You can debate the law, but how do you debate a man saying, "I used to be this way, and now I am this way"? He left the ultimate outcome, the persuasion part, out of his own hands.
It's pure existential evidence. Which brings us to another example from the text, the healed blind man in John chapter 9. This is framed as the ultimate mic drop moment.
Oh, absolutely.
The religious leaders are grilling this guy. They are demanding complex theological explanations for how he was healed. They want to know the mechanics, the physics, the legal ramifications of a healing on the Sabbath. And his response is just brilliant in its simplicity. He basically says, I don't know the theology. One thing I know, I was blind and now I see. You literally cannot intellectually refute that.
You really can't. And that undeniable nature of authenticity is why the material warns so strongly against what it calls religious performance.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because we see this everywhere today, not just in religion. We talked about the pressure to be an expert, but there's also this cultural pressure to impress. Think about it like an Instagram-ready testimony or a polished LinkedIn humble brag. Modern culture pressures us to have flashy, dramatic, perfectly curated stories. If you didn't have a sudden, tear-filled, dramatic turning point in your life, you might feel like your story isn't good enough to share.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, there is a very real psychological danger in the desire to script and sanitize our lives. When we edit out the ongoing struggles, the periods of severe doubt, and the messy, nonlinear reality of personal growth, we flatten the story. We turn a complex human life into a digestible marketing formula.
And when you do that, two very damaging things happen. First, it causes immediate disillusionment for the listener. People have great radar for authenticity. When a story is too perfect, they sense it's staged. It feels like a sales pitch instead of a genuine conversation. And second, it causes deep shame for everyone else who has a quiet, ordinary, maybe even boring journey. They internalize the idea that their entirely valid experience is somehow insufficient.
The author brings in a famous biblical concept to counter this, the idea of jars of clay, referencing the book of 2 Corinthians. The underlying philosophy there is that God's power is actually made perfect in human weakness. In a psychological sense, admitting your ongoing struggles, your doubts, and your glaring imperfections doesn't weaken your story. It actually builds immense trust.
That makes total sense.
There's a concept in psychology called the pratfall effect, where highly competent people become more likable and trustworthy when they make a mistake or admit a flaw. It proves to the listener that you are human, just like them.
That is such a crucial distinction. A personal testimony should never be a PR campaign for yourself. The text makes this brilliant cutting point. If you are the hero of the story, overcoming all odds through your sheer willpower, it's marketing. But if God is the hero of the story and you are just the flawed recipient of grace, it's worship.
This raises an important question about our underlying motives. That shift from performance to authenticity is vital. When our goal is to impress the audience, we inevitably manipulate the narrative. We embellish. We hide the ugly parts. But when the goal is to humbly bear witness to what has been done in our lives, it completely disarms the listener's resistance because it removes the threat. It says, I don't have all the answers, I'm still figuring this out, but here's what I know to be true for me.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? How do you actually put this into practice without feeling weird or aggressive or like you're cornering someone at a coffee shop?
Right, nobody wants to do that.
The document doesn't just leave us floating in high-level theory. It provides a remarkably practical toolkit. It breaks down a simple, 4-part framework for crafting your story in just about 3 minutes.
Yes, and the structure is designed to be accessible to absolutely anyone, regardless of their background or public speaking ability. Step 1 is the before. Who were you? And the advice here is deeply insightful. Focus on your identity and your longings, not just listing out a resume of your past failures or trying to shock the listener with your trauma. What were you searching for? Was it control, approval, peace?
Step 2 is the encounter. How did the change actually begin? And again, the material stresses heavily that this does not have to be a cinematic, lightning bolt moment. A quiet realization over months, a slow shift in perspective, or a meaningful conversation with a friend is just as powerful as a dramatic epiphany.
Step 3 is the after, what shifted. The key here is to focus on direction, not perfection. This goes back to avoiding the PR campaign. You aren't claiming to have it all together now. You are simply explaining how your priorities, your internal attitudes, or your relationships have changed direction.
And finally, step 4 is present hope. Why does this matter today? How does this story sustain or guide you right now in the middle of whatever challenges you're currently facing?
But the framework isn't just about what you say. It's about how you say it. The text provides some crucial rules of engagement or guardrails for sharing this kind of deeply personal narrative. The absolute foundation of authentic testimony is listening first. You cannot share your story effectively if you don't first understand the context, the pain, and the specific needs of the person sitting across from you.
Which means you share your story as an open hand, not a clenched fist or a pressure tactic. You don't coerce. You offer it as a gentle invitation, exactly like that Samaritan woman saying, "Come and see." And perhaps most importantly, if you follow the logic of this text, you have to trust the outcome to something bigger than yourself. Your only job is to be a faithful witness to your own life, not to force a conversion or win a debate.
When we try to control the outcome, when we need the other person to agree with us to feel validated, we immediately slip back into performance mode. But when we release the need to control their reaction, we can speak with genuine freedom, honesty, and vulnerability.
We've covered a lot of ground today, pulling from a deeply theological perspective on communication and human connection. But the core takeaway is incredibly grounding, no matter what your personal beliefs are. You don't need a microphone, a platform, or a perfectly crafted philosophical argument to make a difference. You don't need to be an expert. You just need to be willing to steward the ordinary, unfinished, perfectly imperfect story you are currently living. Your lived experience, with all its human flaws and ongoing struggles, is the most disarming and powerful tool you have.
To close our deep dive today, I want to leave you with a thought to mull over. Think about the parts of your life or your past that you are currently trying the hardest to fix, sanitize, or hide away from the world. What if those unresolved, messy chapters aren't liabilities that need to be managed? What if, according to the paradigm we've explored today, they are actually the exact raw material intended to be used as your most undeniable, powerful point of connection tomorrow?
That is a deeply provocative thought to sit with. Thank you all so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.